to render the prayer.
Prayer. Heavenly Father, we pray to ask for wisdom and guidance. We do. We can only, but only you know the future. So plan our path and help us to make the program successful for us and for all our participants. Make this prayer through your holy name.
Welcome back. Before we begin today's session, let me give a brief report of the proceedings of Day 2, which were held on 12th June 2020. The session began with a prayer by Ms. Joyce Ambrose, and the first session began with a lecture by Dr. Uma Maheshwari Brugubanda, who spoke on the topic Cultural Studies in India. This was followed by an academic interaction with the participants. The next session was conducted by Sri Mohan Krishna Indraganti, who gave an interesting declamation on From Word to Image, the challenges in adapting literary works to films. It was followed by an engaging interaction of the participants. In today's session, we have with us Dr. Shweta Mukherjee, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Christ University, Bangalore. She will enlighten us on the topic, English Studies in the Post-Pandemic Times. Welcome, Dr. Shweta Mukherjee. I think you can take over.
Thank you so much, ma'am. First of all, thank you to Stella College and thank you to Stella College.
Dr. Shweta, sorry for interrupting you.
No problem, ma'am.
I would now request my faculty member, Mrs. B. Shantasri, to give a brief introduction of your biodata. Excuses, 1 minute.
I'm happy to introduce Dr. Shweta Mukherjee to the webinar, who is an old friend of Stella College. She has conducted FDP at Stella College twice on behalf of Christ University, Bangalore. Dr. Shweta Mukherjee has a PhD in English language education and has been working in higher education for 5 years. She is an assistant professor with the Department of English Studies at Christ University, Bangalore. She was a Fulbright scholar in the year 2012-2013. To the University of West Georgia, Carrollton, Georgia, USA. She has been working with the Teaching Learning Enhancement Cell at Christ since 2015 and has worked extensively on the teaching, learning, and assessment practices across the university. She did her research on developing emotional intelligence in the language classroom. Her areas of interest involve whole person education, faculty training in higher education pedagogy, and assessment in higher education. She has also presented papers in many national and international conferences, both in India and abroad. Thank you, Shweta ma'am, for accepting our invitation.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Maristella College, for having me here. It's an extremely great honor to be a part of this one of a kind webinar with a series of very, very distinguished panelists and speakers. And I am a tad bit nervous. Because I'm speaking to an audience that has been, a lot of you have been teaching for a lot more years than I do. So I would just like to say that it's not an exercise to sort of enlighten or throw new perspectives or lights on how do we look at English studies, but rather a sort of collective exercise is how I would like to see in terms of our struggles and concerns and our constant interaction with English studies in the current times and the times to come. And I hope that I'll get to learn a lot more from such a great audience and all of you who are there through our interactions. Satyasudha ma'am, thank you so much for this opportunity. And yes, we are old friends. We've been to Maristella College, and it's amazing to see the initiatives that Maristella has been taking. And I think we very closely associate with the entire, all the schools at Maristella College. So with that, I would like to begin. I will be presenting. I have a very short PPT, just to keep us on track. And but I would not be able to see the chat comments. So if there are any things in between that you would like to share, or if or we can keep it by till the end of this little discussion, we can do it either way. So I'll just start the presentation now, and if somebody can help me with the chat in case there's a need, I'll be really obliged.
Yeah, Shweta ma'am, we will read out loud whatever is there in the chat box later on. After your session is over, we'll have an interactive session.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Proceed. You can proceed, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. I'll just get to the presentation in a while. Just a second. Please tell me if you can see the presentation. Is it visible, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am. It's coming.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah.
It'll take, I think, a few seconds.
Okay.
Just
let me know, ma'am, if you can see it.
Yeah. Not yet. It is. The slide is not yet visible, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am. 1 second. I'll just.
Yeah.
Yes. I think there is an. I'll just do this again. Sorry about that.
No. It's okay, ma'am.
Yeah. So I'll try and share the entire screen, and probably then you'll be able to see them.
Yes.
Is it visible now, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So at the very outset, I would like to say that I am not going to, refer to a lot of research or, make it a very research-oriented, a very theoretical presentation, because I think that over the past 2 days, we've been hearing from really established people in the field of English studies who have spoken and deliberated on a lot of, uncertainties that we are dealing with in theoretical terms. And I think that has laid the foundation for what we're going to talk about today. And I also feel that so this is more of this would be more of what I, as an individual teacher of English studies belonging to the Department of English Studies, I am experiencing during this time, and how I think we will begin to look at English studies in the post-pandemic times. So just to start off, the very word pandemic, I think, has entered our dictionary in a huge fashion. Nobody imagined that this would be the case before March 24th. I still remember that we were doing this series of workshops with, sorry, the Teaching, Learning, Evaluation Cell. And we were scheduled for 2 trips to 2 different colleges for teacher training. And I was having a conversation with my colleague in her office, and I said, she said, I'm a little worried about this whole COVID thing. It might affect the way we are looking at our classrooms. It might impact the way we are looking at teaching. And even at that point, when it was almost taking over the entire Western world, Europe, and of course our side of the world in terms of China, it had kind of made its foray into India, but not so much. I was still away from it mentally and physically, and I probably was, I wouldn't say in denial, but I did not realize the impact that this condition could have on us. And I told her, I don't think it's going to affect us. As a university, we don't close for anything. So I'm sure we are not going to close down for this. And 1 week later, all our trip plans were cancelled. The university declared that we would be closed. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know how long we are going to be closed. And I think what followed, the 21-day lockdown period, was perhaps one of the most uncertain periods that I have found myself in as an individual, as a teacher, because I still remember the day before we closed, we were supposed to schedule our final exams. So we were starting to sort out question papers, and we said that initially the final exam was postponed from 15th April to 15th May, and 15th March to 15th April. And we were told that, we will, the last day of last working day, we still had a meeting in the afternoon where we were told that, look, at some point, there's no order from anywhere that we can't begin the exam in 1 month. So we'll still come back. And so there was a lot of uncertainty, but we came back home thinking that it's going to be maybe a 1 month, a 20-day ordeal, and we are going to get through this. And eventually we'll reopen. And it's been from, I think, the 24th of March, we closed in around last week of April, so to when the government declared holidays, schools and colleges were closed, till today, and we are still unsure when we are going to reopen. So I think that's why it's more of a personal sharing of how we have been dealing with a complete state of uncertainty, unsurety, to probably a place where we have where we have befriended our unsurety, where we have made peace with the fact that this is how it is going to be for some time, and probably taken it upon ourselves to realize that yes, it is unsure, but then what is sure anyway? So with that, I would just like to begin this little sharing session, is what I would call it. One of the things that I would like to begin it, and I've kind of looked at my presentation in 2 distinct ways. One is to look at how literature itself has incorporated disasters, crisis moments of crisis, individual and community and societal, into what it constitutes, into how it constitutes a crisis, and how we have looked at it in terms of literature that we read and write, we interact with every day, in terms of classical literature, in terms of books and novels that came out during periods of crisis, major humanitarian crisis. And also at another level, to look at, because my background is from education, is from ELT, and I've been working in the area of higher education for quite some time now. The second half of my presentation is essentially to look at how this entire pandemic has changed the way we are bringing English studies into the classroom. So that part is slightly more experiential. Again, coming from a very individual sort of interaction with what I have, whatever I've been doing over the past couple of months. So this is how I've looked at my entire session for this day. Now, if you look at what you have in front of your screen, I think all of us are familiar with at some point with all these works, and most of this is just an example, but in times of crisis, like I said, whether it is individual crisis, whether it is the crisis of a community, or whether it is a pandemic, which has now become a humanitarian crisis, we've always sought out literature. Because at some point, a crisis has always given rise to or it has very deeply impacted the way we look at society. It has deconstructed our belief systems, our ways of life. It has shaken our existing structures, and that gets reflected in literature of the times. So, for example, we've had writers like Rabindranath Tagore write about the smallpox in many poems and stories and fictions, and we've had Ahmed Ali, who talks about the Spanish flu, which took around 17 million people in the 1918. He talks about it in his novel Twilight in Delhi. We have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Times of Cholera. I think one of the most beautifully, romantic novels written with a backdrop of something that destroyed half of the world and probably is still a raging problem in many countries across the world. So, with every event, every major humanitarian crisis at any given point that we have, every devastating event that we have faced that has destroyed society has also ironically given birth to some of the most great, some of the most amazing stories. And when I writing about stories, I remember reading this in when I teach. I also teach a paper in literary theory, and I remember telling my students in one fine class that even science begins with a narrative. So narratives have a very, very powerful impact on how we constitute the notion of the self, the notion of the society, and I think literature comes in there. And this pandemic has also probably been one of the I will not talk about it in past. I'll talk about it as it is. It's probably one of the situations that we will come out of with producing our own narratives of coping mechanisms, of dealing with how we are, of the semblance of normality in an extremely abnormal, unfamiliar situation, and I think of largely the indomitable human spirit and the struggle for survival. Because I don't think there can be any other way in which you can see this pandemic. In fact, just yesterday, I probably for the first time in so many months, second time actually, went out of my house, and I realized that if you look at I live in a very busy area in Bangalore, Kormangla, and for the longest time it didn't seem like Kormangla at all, because the streets were desolate, people were moving around, very few people were moving around, half the shops were closed. But yesterday when I got out of the house, I almost had a sense of normality. But at the same time, it's not normal because I am not able to travel to other cities. I am not able to, I'm wearing a mask every time I go out. I'm talking to people with the help of a screen. But if you look outside, there is an illusion of normality. And I think to a large extent, literature in these times helps us negotiate with that illusion of normality and make us question what is the new normal. So we are all saying masks are the new normal, which wasn't true 3 months back. So if you look at how we look at literature in during and post a major humanitarian crisis like a pandemic, I think it sort of rewires the way we look at society. It reestablishes our codes of conduct. It reestablishes our relationships with the community. And I think that is something that we are probably going to see. We probably are seeing across this pandemic, and we are probably going to see after this pandemic as well. What is interesting, I found in literature, is that we've always had this sense of apocalypse. We've always known that there will be an apocalypse and there will be a post-apocalyptic world. So if you look at the genre of post-apocalyptic fiction or dystopian fiction to a large extent, we've talked about a world after something like this, after a major humanitarian crisis like the pandemic. We've talked about what kind of a world will we live in. Way back, I think there was this one novel written way back in 1912 by Jack London, and I think it was called The Scarlet Plague. And it begins by describing a very similar situation to what we're dealing today, where an entire nation, an entire country is put in quarantine. And what happens, how people deal with this whole idea of the plague. So imagine something that was written in 1912, way back, almost reliving reality across periods of time now in the 2020, and also in terms of how it is being depicted as the new normal. So I think one way in literature that we can look at in the post-pandemic way in English studies is the emergence of a discourse yet again that talks about how human nature, human behavior, human societies, human beliefs have been deconstructed and reconstructed across this pandemic, across several narratives, across economical, political narratives, across the narratives of, within the pandemic, we've had issues of race, we've had issues of gender, we've had a closer home, we've had issues of identity, all of that mixed within the larger sort of a backdrop of the pandemic. So much so that in certain countries now the pandemic is a backdrop, where there are more burning racial issues. But at the same time, you can never escape the fact that that this is not gone, that COVID-19 is still here. I may be giving myself an illusion of normality, but it is still here. So one of the things I think we will see is an emergence of a lot more ways of expression, and they need not be always in terms of published novels, but even narratives that we write, even narratives that we look at in terms of oral narratives that we exchange, smaller instances that we exchange, literature, of our large literary paradigm that we work with. The other part, I think, is something that most of you, I just had to add this because I thought you cannot talk about literature and not talk about how popular culture has always been on very friendly terms with large humanitarian disasters. The reason I say friendly is because we have depicted disasters like that, like these, based on our experiences with other larger calamities that we have faced with in the world through various films. And of late, I remember that when the first 21-day lockdown was announced, one of the things that I did is maybe it was a coping mechanism, I don't know, is actually go and watch films on pandemics. I have no idea why that happened, but it did. And I think a lot of us watched these films during the entire lockdown period because it probably told us that this is not a situation that we are not familiar with, that this is not a situation that is once in a lifetime. Of course, once in our lifetimes, I think none of us, when we entered 1st January 2020, believed that we would be in a situation where we would be sitting in our houses, where we would be looking at the screen and talking to a large group of people who, despite the fact that we can't see them, will establish a sense of community. So I think popular culture did play a very, very large role in depicting how we survive a pandemic, and also just to give us a sense of hope. Because at the end of all of these films, these are again just samples, these are just representational samples. If you look at, I think most of us would have watched Contagion by now. Some of us would have watched Outbreak. Viruses was actually a Malayalam film which was based on the Nipah virus outbreak. In all of this, I think what I found common, whether you look at novels that were written during the pandemic times, whether you look at films that were produced about pandemics and diseases that have spread like wildfire across the world, I think what is essential to note is that at the end of it, there is a very, very strong spirit of fighting, of putting up a fight, of not just, this is probably one of those fights where you don't fight to win, but you fight to survive. And I think that right now is the essence of what we do with our literature. One might ask, in a time when we require vaccines and science, what does literature contribute? And I think I remember this going back to the first session where the first speaker was asked, so what is literature's contribution to the society? And I think as students of literature, we've always had this. We don't produce ready-made contributions. So an engineering teacher would say, my students are engineers. A medical teacher would say, my students are doctors. They are frontline warriors. They are working. So what does literature contribute? How do we contribute to anything that we are doing? I think why we need literature, and especially literature in times like this, and to negotiate with times like this and for times to come, is because for literature, or in literature, sorry, rather, these are not events in time. These are events they're not just events in time in terms of, they're not just historical processes, but they're ahistorical processes that for a very long time to come like I said, are going to reorient the ways our perspectives are going to probably give rise to new theoretical ways of looking at things. Also, in terms of the fact that I think literature regards events with compassion, with the human in it, which is it's not just a set of events or a series of events, but an event where human life is at stake, where the humans become the center. All living beings, not just humans, but all living beings become the center of crisis, where we are probably exposed to our most vulnerable selves in different manners, in manners where where we couldn't have even fathomed who we are. We also deal with questions of identity, as individual identity, as societal identity. So when, for instance, at the risk of being slightly controversially political here, in the midst of one of the greatest pandemics in that our generation will probably ever see, one of the most powerful countries of the world decides to withdraw funding from an organization which is working to the best of its capacity, probably to look at to fund research that is going on to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak. But of course, these are political decisions. So just to look at how human nature is in times like this, I think, and again, these are not I'm not making these comments in terms of making judgment, because I think that's not the place of English studies. We're not here to make judgments, but we are here to represent the situations as they are, and to look at how does this human spirit cope with this situation, right? So and again, like I said, in popular culture, in written literature, in novels, in shorter narratives that we read, all of these deal with different kinds of ways of understanding the human spirit, understanding the human amidst a pandemic that threatens the very core of humanity, that brings us to the basic questions of life versus death. What is wearing a mask for you? Is it a question? Is it a political symbol, or is it rather a symbol of being alive and caring? So I think literature brings in that compassion, that deeper sensibility, that understanding. For literature, the COVID-19 pandemic, for people in English studies, for people in humanities as such, the pandemic is not just a set of statistics, a set of historical records. It is much more than that. Also, at the same time, like I said, literature becomes a source of consolation. So when we look at post-pandemic times and English studies, and the way we deal with English studies in post-pandemic times, I think what we are eventually going to look out for is, how did we manage to get out of this? And I'm sure we will get out of this at some point, in probably very different ways than we would have imagined. But at some point, there will be a vaccine. At some point, the COVID-19 will be a thing of the past. But what will be interesting to note is, for our narratives during this time, to look at how we won, well, I wouldn't say won over, but how we sort of survived something like this, which we thought would never affect us, would not be possible, etc. So I think here I would like to mention something that Professor Harish Trivedi he's a professor of literature at DU, says that literature becomes a source of consolation. It becomes a source of a common sharing of human experiences, which is essentially which is essentially what the world has seen after every pandemic, through different means. And what is interesting is, I do not take one static meaning of literature. For me, literature is a much more inclusive term. And that is why what we understand as literature would also probably change after our entire notions of literature have been deconstructed in different ways. So again, how do we look at the world? What are the changes that we want to see in the world? What was also interesting is, I was actually looking up quite a few webinars that have been happening off late. We've dealt with questions of identity, of body, of representation. At the same time, we've also dealt with questions of teaching literature in the post-pandemic world, teaching English studies in the post-pandemic world, teaching English literature and language. And like, I would go back to the first speaker, after a point, you can't really separate literature from language, because you teach one through the other. So I think that brings me to the next, and perhaps one of the most, for me, one of the most engaging sections of how we look at literature, is to redefine the way we look at how we teach English studies, how we exist as departments of English studies, how we reorient ourselves to who we are, what we do and how we do it. So when I chose these two images, I was very, very conscious of what I was choosing. If you notice the image that says, "Sorry, we are closed," it looks at a classroom and it looks at nobody in the classroom. It's an empty classroom. And I think for a teacher of literature, that is probably one of the most melancholic sights you can ever come across. Because for us, as teachers of English literature, of English studies, the human connection is extremely important for us. We need to be able to see our students. We need to be able to look at them. We need to be able to see what they understand. Most of our classrooms were discussions and lectures and extremely animated discussion oriented, but we have sort of had to make the transportation to a completely anonymous medium where all I have access to is a screen. And I think to an extent, this is not something that when I started out teaching, or when I even started out, looking at English as a subject that I would be teaching in future, had ever imagined. Because for me, when I teach a subject, it is very important for me to be able to look at my students. And the way we have looked at classroom spaces has completely changed over the past 2 months, which is interesting because we've never thought about other spaces other than what you see in terms of rows of tables and chairs as classrooms. We've never thought that learning, especially learning of English and literature, can transpire completely from a classroom to to a different space altogether, where there is the whole idea of a classroom is challenged. So just to negotiate with the notion of space and learning, and specifically looking at it in terms of teaching English literature, I think that is something that that would change in how we look at it in during and post the pandemic. The other thing that I would like to say is, so a lot of, like I said, a lot of this would be discussion oriented, would be from what I have felt as a teacher, what I have identified with as a teacher. So I was listening to this a lot of conversations over over several universities that are happening, and some of them we are lucky enough that we have access to through the digital world. One of the things that I think has been said or reiterated again and again across disciplines, and specifically with disciplines such as humanities and literature and English studies, is that this complete mergence of our private and public life once we switch to the online medium. To just simplify it, today when I was actually not today, when when Satyasudha ma'am gave me a call and said, "Would you like to do something like this?" And I said, I can only talk about what I am struggling with, or I'm coping with right now in terms of as an English teacher, because I think we need platforms to talk about it. And she said, "Yeah, well, you can go ahead with that." So the first thing that I thought of was not what would be the content of my presentation. Of course, that came in much later. But where would I sit? Because my entire background is exposed to a set of audience that I have never seen, that most of them whom I have never seen, they would be listening to me, but they would also be looking at me in ways that I never thought I would present myself. So I never thought that whether I have a bookshelf behind me or an empty wall or a picture is almost integral to taking a class. And I remember when we began classes at our university almost 4 weeks back now, and we had an instruction, well, not an instruction manual, but a set of guidelines that the university laid out with discussions from the faculty members. And one of the things that we were told is, be conscious of the background that you put yourself in, because you are reaching out to an audience, you are letting them in, even however little it is, to a world that is your own, that has been your own for a very long time. Because when you walk to a classroom, you have a different persona that you put on. But when you're sitting in your house or wherever you're sitting, you probably want to carry on that persona, but something in your background might just give it away. And so we become conscious of the fact that our private lives are no longer private. Our students have moved into our study areas, our bedrooms. Our colleagues have moved into our study areas, our sitting areas, our bedrooms, who would otherwise probably visit your home only once, are now a regular visitor to your houses because of the digital interaction. So that entire deconstruction of what is the normal, that you meet your colleagues in office, you have meetings in round table rooms where you have space, and and the way you dress for a meeting is formal. I think all of that has gone through a major reorientation, and that is something that is here to stay, pandemic or not. Because if you notice that a lot of a lot of how we work is being changed completely, though I don't think that as a space in education we are going to shift completely to online mediums anytime soon, and I hope not, because like I said, I want to see my students, I want to be in the university and interact with my colleagues and deliberate on this whole notion of who we are, our identities post the pandemic. But it is here to stay. At any given point, when we have any crisis, this is something that we are going to resort to. So that is something that's going to majorly change in the way we look at teaching and learning of literature post these times. Also, I think one of the speakers in a conversation, it was called a sort of Berkeley conversation, clearly points out that this is not just a health crisis, it is not just a social crisis, it is a humanitarian crisis. And like every crisis, it disrupts what we otherwise know as our daily reality, at something that we are used to. So it kind of reveals the fundamentals of our society, the fundamentals of different systems, and this has been no different. So it has scrambled our public and private life. It has entangled our public and private worlds in ways that we now probably didn't even realize. Normal structures of everyday lives have fallen apart, have fallen away. But what is interesting is that we have come to create new structures, new ways of life, new ways of coping with everything that we have to cope with. And being a teacher in an English studies classroom is one of those, because we have tried to redefine our own understandings of classroom before we even go into a digital classroom. So, for example, we have found other ways of connecting with our students. We have found other ways of discussions. A lot of our literature classes used to be lecture oriented, especially when they were literature classes and not focusing on English language. We always believed that literature classes may have some amount of discussion, but majorly it would be a discourse oriented class where we don't have too many activities that we include in a 50-minute class. But if you look at how we have redefined complete literature classes, I think that is interesting. So that is something that I think would be a new learning, at least at an individual level for me, in a post-pandemic class. And I think this is something that we need to focus on here. I think Satyasudha ma'am and was pointed out in my introduction, I have been extensively involved in higher education teaching and learning, and for the last 2 months, we have been doing classes. Obviously, I'll come to my classes a little later. But what we have also been extensively dealing with is a pouring request for online teaching, teacher training. Essentially, we just had a mail yesterday from our own university saying, look, it's a IQAC requirement, and we believe that the teaching learning enhancement cell, of which I'm proud to be a part of, can aid. So I think online teaching, so words, if you look at just the vocabulary that we have gotten over the past 2 months, it's unimaginable for me. Pandemic, online teaching, quarantine, self-quarantine, social distancing, stay home, stay safe. These have become our regular register. These have added or expanded the register of English students, English studies, and English literature in different, various, unimaginable ways. So, like I said, one of the things that I have looked at extensively is online teaching, and also online teaching with respect to our discipline of English studies. I picked this meme up very, very carefully, because this is essentially what most of us are going through as teachers right now. It A lot of us think, oh, teaching English literature on online or offline does not make much of a difference, because essentially you're going to lecture. So how does it matter? So you do some research, and you probably just think about what you're going to teach, and you're teaching it, right? And at the same time, there is a large demand on teachers, on specifically teachers, on English teachers and other teachers as well, in terms of the fact that each student should get exposure, each student should get equal opportunity, each student should have the ways and means to attend online classes. You are also, so you have the society's perception to deal with. You have your own ideas of who you are as a teacher to constantly negotiate with your identity. You also have the practical problem of actually teaching English online, actually teaching a paper in American literature and post-colonial literature and British literature online. And I think it's a very interesting a very sort of weirdly functional integration of all of these attributes that have come together to doing what we do right now. Couple of days back, I had a conversation. We had a series of conversation between a couple of my colleagues. I was the third party, so I was just reading those conversations in WhatsApp about this constant struggle of being an English teacher, talking about literary cultural theories, the theory of the body, the theory of the mind, the theory of what the body represents in a very disembodied or via a very disembodied medium. As of now, I am just a voice on a system. So if I switch off my camera, I usually switch it off when I'm talking to my students because of bandwidth and other issues. And not every day do I want to dress up for a class because, it also makes me feel that I wish I could go to the class, physically walk to a class. So I switch off my cameras. But the moment I switch off my camera, I become just a voice. And all of you, all of my students are listening to just the voice, probably an image that I would like to present of myself, but just the voice. And a lot of our theories that we work with in English studies talk about the self, the creating the conscious identity of the self, identifying with the image that you see in the mirror as the self. But where is the self in online teaching? How do we renegotiate our ideas of self? What do we present ourselves as? How do we make sense of who we are when we're talking essentially to a system, through a system, to a group of people who we can't see, who probably can't see you at most of the time. So this whole idea, this whole notion of the disembodied self is something that I think a lot of us are grappling with, probably even subconsciously, because we're not even thinking that we are online, because this is the new normal. We have to teach it, we have to be in class, and we have to talk about theories that talk about body and self through a medium that disembodies us. We have to talk about theories that talk about identity and creation of identity through a medium that disembodies us. We have to talk about struggles of great struggles of human society, talk about the humane in a human society, again through a medium that has disembodied the way we actually understand our physical selves, our bodies, right? So again, that is, I think, something that we are also grappling with in terms of how do we teach theories that probably at this point we are not even adhering to, because the practice is so different. There is such a huge gap between what we are teaching and how we are teaching it through a different medium. So I think that becomes that is something that I would probably work into my teaching after or during the pandemic, to just look at how we understand body, how we understand identity, how we understand self, how we understand representations of self, how images are created, how society looks at an English teacher teaching English literature in a class of students through computer. That is one thing. I have also been teaching two papers essentially. So I've been teaching this semester, I'm teaching American literature and post-colonial literature. And to a large extent, both these papers deal with theories, especially post-colonial literature actually extensively works with theories of identity of what one is, one's position is in a society. It talks, of course, apart from other things in terms of race and culture, etc. It also talks about how we see ourselves within this society. What is our, what are our subject positions? And when I teach theory like this, I also feel right now, how would these theories work? Do these theories hold true? Are they something that we completely adhere to? Because we talk about how digitalization has made changes in our life, but we also cannot have probably had any of this without digital concerns without digital medium. So that's why I think that the last thought that came on my mind was the English teacher and the struggle to just cope. How do I cope? What do I cope with? Am I doing justice to my discipline? Am I doing justice to my class? Am I doing justice to my thoughts? Am I able to convey what I have to? One of the biggest struggles that I have had teaching American literature and post-colonial literature is, so when I teach literature, I also connect it a lot to depictions of events in popular culture. So I used to show a lot more videos in my class, and then carry forward discussions of race and nation state and all of that. With my online teaching, what has become difficult is incorporating videos into the medium that I use for online teaching, because they take time to buffer. Also, the fact that each video might take a lot more time for a student to kind of see and respond to. So just so for me, I have to think of new ways of teaching a chapter in Native American literature, or sorry, a poem in Native American literature. I have to think of new ways of teaching race, which does not involve showing a video that explicitly talks about race, but which involves using different other ways. So one of the things that I think worked very well, and again, like I said, we are teaching synchronously and asynchronously. So we are teaching 3 hours in a day, one subject, post-colonial literature. And I have to think about different ways of discussions, because my classes used to be extremely discussion oriented. And the first day of teaching, when I started, I realized that I cannot have an American literature or a post-colonial literature class without raising questions and letting my students answer them. But how do I do it? For example, now I can see my presentation, but I can't see the chat. I can see my presentation, but I can't see all of your expressions. I can, I don't know whether what I'm saying to across. And I have the same struggle in my classroom as well. I don't know what my students are listening for three hours. I don't know when I'm passionately talking about race and colonialism and imperialism. Are my students sort of seeing through my passion? Because they can't see me. My camera is off. They can only hear my voice. And I cannot invite an 80 student class for discussion by unmuting themselves, because then I'm losing out on the 1.5 or 3 hours of class that I have. So one of the things that it has done to me is, or online or thinking about English studies has done to me, is to look at new ways of how I teach a novel, is to look at new ways of how I teach a narrative, a short story. How do I teach theory through this medium? So I've been for instance, I started off a class on race and colonialism by looking at a few advertisements that we see on our billboards almost every day when we are walking across. And so as soon as my class entered, they had, instead of me or instead of a PPT, they had a couple of ads posted in the class. And I said, so all of you can see this. And they were like, yeah. And it's surprising because we enter the class and this is what we see. And then we began an entire discussion on chat, via different other digital mediums, on how ideas of race are incorporated into different societies, how different societies react to it. And then moved into a part where I had a little lecture. And then again moved into a part where we were all working together in real time on Google Classroom to ideate how we look at race and colonialism. So, just the way I taught racism and colonialism this semester in a post-colonial paper is remarkably different from what I've been doing in the past 3 years. There were times when I would just go into a class and I don't really need a PPT to go, or don't really need any solid textbook material to go, because I can go and talk and I can see my students and they can participate in the discussion. I have a blackboard handy where I can write stuff. I can play a video on race and gender and ask them to talk. I had to deal with all those limitations here. So, just to look at the amount of time I've thought of what would work for my students when I am teaching them online in a medium. Do I have anything that is depicting a background that probably would contradict with what I'm saying? These little details become very important. So that was one thing. The second thing, I think, as an English teacher, I also found it difficult to sort of talk about narratives in terms of fiction through a medium like this, because I believe that when you teach fiction, when you teach poetry, that is again something where you require a lot of human interaction, a lot of responses, facial expressions, when you look at your students. And that was completely missing here in this class, because I had 67 students in my class, American literature. And usually, we begin American literature by teaching Native American poetry. And one of the things that I do is I always move my classes outside the classroom, because one of the things that we talk about in Native American poetry and indigenous culture is their closeness to nature. And this time I couldn't do it. So I was talking about nature and poetry and closeness to nature and forces of nature through a completely artificial medium. And that was the irony. But I also had to tell them that, this is also reality, a part of literature that you need to accept, a part of literature that you need to get familiar with, that you do talk about two very contradictory things through a contradictory medium, and you are still able to make sense of it. So to just think how I would teach Native American poetry to a group of music majors and theater majors through my computer. That was another that's another something. And I'm not saying I don't have answers to these questions that you see. Because again, it's a very individual experience. It's something that I'm coping with. I wouldn't say coping with right now. Like I said, we are becoming comfortable with the uncertainty of the time. I think we have as students or as teachers of a discipline like English studies, because of the rich narratives that already exist, we probably create our sense of comfort in discomfort, very much more, at least I would think, much more smoothly the transition than probably other disciplines. Like Keats says, the negative capability of being comfortable with discomfort, with unsurety, with the notion that things or the idea of normal can be deconstructed. I think that has happened because we have theories that talked about deconstruction, breaking down barriers, and restructuring the normal. So I think post the pandemic, we are going to see a new kind of normal. Again, being very conscious that that normal is also a construct that is liable to change, that at any given point, what we're dealing with is a set of constructs backed by theory, but probably very different in practice. The way we read literature, the way we look at literature in terms of giving us a way to survive, in terms of coming out of every crisis through talking about it as it is, and also through talking about it in a very emotional, personal, individual term. And at the same time, teaching through a humanitarian crisis like this, teaching English studies through a humanitarian crisis like this, dealing with the different challenges that it poses in terms of the basic mundane realities of the lack of a classroom, which basically means preparing a different class lesson plan, class plan, looking at different kinds of texts that will support what you're trying to say. Another simple example is, if I want my students to read a text now, since they're not sitting in front of me in the class, I can't tell them open your textbooks and read, because I don't really know what they'll be reading. So I've actually divided my texts into components. I would put up what they have to read on the system, and we are all reading together at a certain given time, and then having very basic factual level questions, at the same time very intellectual level discussions on it. I have probably translated a lot of my texts into the concepts that they represent and into visual images, because again, visual aid has become extremely important in how we look at representations now. I have dealt with my own understanding of what I should be doing as an English teacher, how I should be, where I should be, what positions I should occupy, in a completely changed idea of a classroom as such. So these are very real struggles. And in the aspect of theory, or for concentrating in the aspect of theory, you cannot ignore that as English teachers, as teachers of course in general, but as English teachers specifically, as teachers of a subject that that focuses on the human and requires human interaction and talks about emotions and expressions, you're dealing with a medium that probably completely disembodies emotions. So you can't see that little smile that a student gives when they have identified with an idea. You can't see that frown that a student has, or when they are uncomfortable with an example that you give. But what eventually it has brought us down to is that we trust the audience, we trust our students, we trust the medium, because if this mutual trust and understanding is not there, then the way we look at English studies itself, is probably going to be very, very hard for us. The way we interact with our English texts, the way we interact with literature as such, is probably going to be very difficult for us, because at the end of the day, literature is about us, by us, and it is what we want, it is what we experience. That's how I personally read it, because for me, I think every aspect of this online teaching and training, whatever I have been involved in for the past 2 months, has been a lot of retrospection, sorry, introspection into what I do and how I do it, and also the fact that am I making sense? Do I reach an audience? Am I being identifiable? When I teach something, are my students able to identify with my sense of how I see the text? And at one point, I realized it's not important because they need to identify with their sense of how they see the text. And I think the lack of an actual physical presence in a classroom probably has helped with that. Because what the digital medium has also brought in the studying literature or in studying English studies is essentially when I have my classes, I have a parallel chat box running where my students are talking simultaneously to each other and paying attention to what I say. So I get instant responses. So when I was teaching race and colonialism, we had a lot of parallels that were drawn across how we look at race in our society, how we look at the idea of fairness, gender, and all of this were going on while my lecture was going on, and I was responding to them. So I think that has kind of reoriented the way I teach theory. I teach English literature and fiction and any other form of theory, right? So I believe that the reason I called it in the post-pandemic times is because whatever we have learned as individuals and as a society, whatever we have learned about ourselves, our ways of associating with the community, our ways of reaching out to each other, our ways of connecting at a much higher level than just at a physical sort of interactive level, is that even through these very difficult, very challenging, and though it might not seem so now, but these are challenging times, not because we can't go out and meet other people, but also because we are reshifting, reorienting the way we look at societal structures, educational structures, that despite all of this, we will be able to cope. It is a struggle and we will learn, and it's not going to end here because later, at after this entire pandemic is over, at some point this will become our new normal, and the way we look at English studies, the way we look at theory, the way we look at our positions, our interactions with theory and theory and praxis is going to change. And it's never a constant, it's never one thing for everyone, but at the same time I think the collective acceptance of how it is going to change, and the fact that it's going to be different for different people, the fact that our experiences have a much larger role to play in the way we constitute the discipline of English studies, the fact that different kinds of narratives of hope, yes, narratives of of winning, yes, but also narratives of loss, also narratives of grief, narratives of unsurety, narratives of clarity, that the opaque is as important as the transparent, that it's okay to not be able to see yourself through this theoretically, but eventually practically you will. I think all of those narratives will become a part of our post-pandemic world, and I think none of us really thought that we are going to live through something like this, but we are living through it, and we probably are thriving and flourishing in different ways. We are living with the reality of death every day. We are reading about it, and they're not just numbers anymore because they're happening in and around us. The situation is something that has affected the entire world. It's not a part of the world, it is not one nation, it's not one country. So, in the way we look at how we look at the idea of nation itself, what we look at in terms of nation and world is completely reoriented. So I think in the post-pandemic times, I personally feel the way we look at narratives in English studies, the kind of narratives we will be looking at would have much more individual involvement, would be probably sometimes tales of hope, sometimes tales of defeat, but they will be part of our narratives and they will tell us that we survived through these times. And as a teacher, I think that the way we look at teaching English studies, the way we always saw the digital medium as a limitation. I have had this because I teach literature and ELT. A lot of times I've had to have to look at it. This duality, that teachers of literature can't teach language, or it is easy to teach language through an online medium, but not literature. But what is interesting now is none of us can say that anymore because our dualities are merging, because all of us are thinking as teachers of English studies and not teachers of ELT or literature or academic writing, or we're not teaching in terms of compartments, but we're teaching English studies as a discipline. Right now, we all have to think of synchronous or asynchronous activities. We all have to think of going beyond the lecture. We all have to think of classroom interaction. And it doesn't matter whether you're an ELT teacher or a English studies teacher, or a literature teacher, you're dealing with the same reality. So I think post pandemics, the way we look at English studies as a discipline, in terms of what we see in it, and also the way we teach, is going to change remarkably. And this is not something we can predict right now, but a lot of what we are going through now is going to add to that change. So that's what I think is eventually going to happen. Like I said, it's an extremely personal experience. We may have a lot of other sharing. So I would like to listen to everybody, if possible and if time permits, in terms of what are your thoughts and ideas, and hopefully we can have a discussion. So I would end my and probably if Satyasudha ma'am is okay, we can open the floor up for discussion. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, Dr. Shweta Mukherjee, for a extremely relevant talk with a very interesting presentation on English studies in the post-pandemic times.
Thank you, ma'am.
And now we welcome the participants to audio and ask ma'am, or if you want, we can box. Ma'am is ready to answer your queries.
Yeah, I can also read the chat box here. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and talk, I think I would prefer some human voices instead of reading through the chat.
Yes, Shantasri.
Yeah. Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Saranya. I'm a assistant professor of English from St. Paul's College, Bangalore.
Yes, ma'am.
At the outset, congratulations for such a
with proctoring, so I'll answer your question first, ma'am. With proctoring, we at our university have actually begun the exams, and we used a software. We used Metal, which is basically a software for teaching. We are proctoring through that, but it is very interesting, ma'am. Again, so Metal is very system oriented, so it is the system that is flagging it. It is the system that is kind of telling you, if the student is there or not. And 2-3 problems that we encountered were very interesting for us as teachers. So one of my colleagues called me after the second day of exams, and she said, so the way we proctor in Metal is basically you choose your subject, and then you are allowed to have a live feed of the student, and also at the same time you can look at the screen that the student is writing. Metal is extremely efficient in terms of proctoring, but what is also interesting is as teachers of humanities and English studies, we have questions of privacy, to how far can you infringe on the student's privacy. But it's not a comfortable position to be in. But I'll tell you that, so like I was saying, the problems that come with it is we realized that the software was identifying facial expressions of our African American students, of our African students or foreign nationals very differently than it was with our Indian nationals. A lot of times, despite the fact that there's nobody else present in the room, the system keeps flagging the student saying additional person in the room. So what we did is we made the management aware of it, and we also decided that we would keep the student on live feed, ask the student to show us a 360-degree view, and put in a comment in the software saying that there is no one, though the software says there is an additional person, because actually there's nothing. The software is catching noises from outside. The software sometimes, so a lot of times our students are thinking. So my students look up, and the moment they look up to the ceiling, the software flags them as saying, candidate away from the system. The basic thing
away from the screen.
Yes, the candidate is not looking at the screen. So then, and it's so mechanical at one point. So the whole idea of proctoring itself is actually very challenging, because when you realize that eventually what you're doing is placing your trust on the student. Eventually what you're doing is
correct.
I've proctored 4 exams till now, and all of them were our MA students and our triple major students, and being really honest. So I had a student who had I thought what was several tabs were open. And I kept telling her, please close all the other tabs. So she said, ma'am, there is no tab open. And I could see in her screen. So I said, look, I can see your screen. And then I realized that, these were not tabs, they were bookmarks. And I know the student really well. She's not looking at those bookmarks. They're just open. So they're not pages, internet pages. They're just bookmarks. But at the same time, you do give a sort of doubt saying, what if the student's tabs are open? So, and then I decided that no, she's telling me again and again that these are not tabs. I need to put in a comment saying they are bookmarks because so I had to actually enlarge the screen and see. So it is a whole different experience altogether. And I think more than them being proctored, so I had one very interesting case where a student was writing a test and there was somebody sleeping behind her. And I said, look, there is someone in your room. Can you please ask them to leave? So she said, there are only 2 rooms in my house and my father is sleeping behind me. I promise you I will not talk to him. But see, the thing is, I can't put the camera on that student at all times, right? So I have to look at everyone else. What do you do then? So, ma'am, to be very honest, I don't see this as problems and solutions, but I see this as situations that we deal with. And we all,
True.
like teachers, we come up with what works best for us. There is no one solution. There is no one solution for every problem. There are common generic guidelines that we can follow. So, for example, ma'am, the other thing that we are dealing with is attendance. So we have synchronous, asynchronous. Now, how do I account for the asynchronous hours? A lot of my students have connectivity issues, especially after the cyclone in West Bengal. A lot of them would come to class, get disconnected, again come to class.
Yes.
And do I give them attendance for those 2 hours? So on a personal basis, I decided that these are students who are making an effort. They're coming to class, they're interacting, they're doing their asynchronous work. So where do I cut attendance? That's why I said it changes the way we look at teaching learning completely. So I think I don't know if I've answered your question, but
ma'am, you have in fact, as you're talking, I wanted to just, if I may be permitted, just like a minute to tell you about our experience. When we conducted exams also,
Sure, ma'am.
we had similar problems. There were students who had connectivity issues. So there was this child who would travel 1 hour to the nearest place in her father's goods auto.
Sure, ma'am.
And she will have to reach that particular place to write the exam, but the exam would start before that.
Yeah.
So every day she used to have this problem, and when the auto is moving, the system will throw up saying that she is there is this we use another software which is locally viable for us. So the software detects movement. So then this child was moving because she has to move. There is no other choice. She can't sit at home and write. So she had to move and she is writing. So then the student requested if she can record her entire exam and upload it onto her server before the time of the exam gets over. And then we had to get special permission and then figure this whole thing out. And then there was another student who would only be able to connect through calls. So we had problems like this. Like you said, it's situational and really the way we respond to it.
Also,
thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Also, one thing that I would like to talk about just for 2 minutes, if Sudha ma'am, if it's okay, if I can just mention that. So one of the things that
carry on.
As students of, I keep saying students, as teachers of English literature, we have said is setting up the question paper. We've had amazing amount of struggle with it because we realized that the way we look at our questions have to change completely. Our students were writing, but they couldn't probably, some of them were very good with writing, but not with typing. So, to work with word limits, to work with the kind of questions that we were giving, to ensure that there are no or negative, cases of plagiarism, to work with more application oriented, to work with more questions that looked at theory as applied to the current time. So I remember that there was this question in a paper in eco-criticism that talked about a particular eco-critical theory with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the kind of feedback that we got from our students was that it's brilliant how they are finally able to connect theory to what is happening to them. So just to reorient ourselves to even look at disciplinary inclinations that we have in terms of the way we look at question answer. So it's no longer what is the meaning of the story or give a character sketch. Of course, we've come far behind those. Or what does the poet tend to say? But how do you engage a student, reduce a 3-hour exam to a 2-hour exam, still work with the literature paper, still raise concerns that are important for our students to address, ensure that these concerns were discussed in the classes, and still have an exam that does talk about skills such as analysis, evaluating, creating, presenting their arguments, but not within the confines of an English paper. So I think that was important. Uh, Anything else? I'm just reading out the questions here. Uh, uh, Yes, I think Shiva Kumari ma'am, you said we can't read out the students to modulate or tailor our pace for teaching. I agree. The other thing, but what happens is since you can interact with the students, so after two classes of American literature, so I did two different ways of taking that literature class. In one class, I did a 1.5 hour of lecture, teaching, interaction, and 1.5 hour of work that they had to do at home. In the second class, I made a sort of mix. So I did throughout a 3 hour class, they had a 50-minute class, which is their normal, had activities that were interspersed with the class. So then I asked my students, because this was again both the classes that I'm teaching, I have never met the students. These are second year students who I'm teaching for the first time. And I'm teaching American literature and post colonial literature, which involve large amount of reading as well. So I asked them what would work. So my students then said that, ma'am, I think it works better if you teach us through the 3 hours with activities and tasks in between, because we get feedback, and also it helps us read. Once you leave us on our own after 1.5 hours, we may read whenever we want, but we can't participate in the discussion. So I understand that we can't probably see their faces and look at their experience, but we make best of the digital mediums that we have. That was one thing that I did to deal with my own class. Also, I think I was looking at one question. Somebody said, I can't reach the question right now, but somebody said, how do we work with student concentration? I think, ma'am, one of the things we have to understand is student attention span. It's less than 7 minutes, I think, in a class, in a typical attention span. And the recent online class model that we have adapted as a department, because of several other constraints, when you work online, is for each subject, if we have a 75-hour paper, right now, usually in a regular face-to-face mode, there will be five 50 minutes classes over a week. For the online classes, we are now doing 3 hours in a week, because we are also teaching different subjects. Now, like I said, if you do a 3 hour lecture continuously, you will not be able to hold attention. You will not be able to hold concentration. If you do not connect what you're saying to what is currently happening, you will not be able to hold their concentration. I think I sort of lucked out in the fact that I was going to teach American literature and post colonialism. And in both the cases, I was dealing with race. And that worked brilliantly in terms of tying up with what was happening, the sorry state of America as a nation, and race as a concept. So I actually brought in the George Floyd event, the contemporary event, worked into American racial history, and sort of connected it. So that's when my students said, it is a 3 hour. So I had to tell them, I'm really sorry, we took 3 hours of class. I was supposed to give you 1 hour of work. And they said, no, we really like it. So, and I was very surprised, because to sit through a 3 hour lecture or class, I think, is extremely difficult. But it is difficult to ensure that they concentrate. But at the same time, if you put in your activities, your discussions, your questions, that will make them think, because you're dealing with students of humanities. They have to think. I think that is one of the very basic skills that we incorporate, critical thinking. And if we can put it into our lessons, I think that will work brilliantly with how we look at literature. Also, even when you look at English language teaching, not just literature, if you look at communications, if you look at other forms of subjects that you might be teaching, just to look at how. So, of course, I think for me as an ELT practitioner, that is slightly easier in terms of how I would teach a communicative English class or an academic writing class, because for me that is easier in terms of monitoring the hands-on work, the kind of activities I design, etc., etc. So yeah, these are mechanisms that personally I have evolved, and a lot of my colleagues are working with. I also have a few colleagues who have a text on screen and then ask a student from the list to read the text out. This is to ensure that student who's probably been a little inactive throughout the class is now suddenly called into attention to read the text out. And if the student can't read, when they immediately reply to a chat saying, "Ma'am, I can't unmute my mic," I know that the student is present. So, those things are again ways to look with ways to deal with concentration, etc. As a teacher of I think humanities and English studies specifically, what I don't insist on is my students keep their cameras on, because I value my privacy a lot, and I believe that my students value their privacy a lot, and I respect them as individuals, so I don't put their cameras on. To a large extent, I think our classes work on trust, because I know in one class I have 80 students, so not just valuing individual privacy, but also the fact that 80 students cannot have their cameras on. I think it's unfair to expect. So I was very actually here in Bangalore insisted that students sit with their uniform in front of a camera. Of course, I do understand that they might have their reasons, because you're trying to bring in a sort of connectivity amongst all these first grade, second grade students. But I was not comfortable with the idea. Similarly, I was not comfortable with the idea that nursery students were having online classes. I do understand the point of academics, but at the same time, I think that's too early. So all of this, as a practitioner of English literature, as a student, as a teacher of humanities, as a student of humanities, I think I have been struggling with. And honestly speaking, I don't have a perfect one size fits all solution. I think it completely depends on how you look at the way you organize. And also, I think another question is the authority of the teacher as such. Your space, your idea and notion of space that you occupy in the classroom, because literally in a digital platform, you're all on the same plane. So I think these are again things that we need to sort of struggle with. So yeah, anything else that anybody else has to say or ask?
Thank you, ma'am. Very relevant answers.
Thank you.
And as you said, I think we Indians overdo everything. So asking, kindergarten students to wear uniforms. You have given very good solutions to make our presentations interesting.
Thank you so much.
If there are any more participants who want to ask or interact, you're welcome. Ahead with the vote of thanks by Mrs. T. Deepthi, Department of English, Stella College.
Good morning, everyone. Honorable resource persons and most valued participants, it's my privilege to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of Department of English, Stella College, Vijayawada. We extend our sincere thanks to Dr. V. Parvati, former professor, Andhra University, Dr. Rosita Joseph V., Assistant Professor, Geetham University, Vizag, Dr. Brugubanda Uma Maheshwari, Assistant Professor, FLU, Sir Mohana Krishna Indraganti, Film Director and Screenwriter, Dr. Shweta Mukherjee, Assistant Professor, Christ University, Bangalore, for making excellent and interesting presentations. We thank the audience for their active participation and very relevant discussions that took place during the interactive sessions. We are grateful to Dr. Sister Jacinta Quadras, our dynamic principal, for her constant support and encouragement in organizing this seminar. We express our heartfelt thanks to our IT team, Mr. K. N. Raju, Mrs. Divya, and Mr. Prasad, system admins, without whose tremendous help and hard work this webinar would not have been possible. Our special thanks to Mrs. Malati, Faculty, Computer Science Department, for her immense help in conducting this webinar. Finally, I thank each and everyone who made this program a grand success. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepthi. I just want to make a few announcements before we close the webinar. Please note that we are going to post the YouTube links of the 3 days in the webinar group, in the WhatsApp group. And please send it to your personal mails or browsers or your WhatsApp, because the group will dissolve as soon as we give away your certificates. And then all the participants have to fill up the feedback forms in order to get the certificates. And you will get your certificates in a few days. Please bear with us. Thank you. If you have anything else to say or express, you're welcome.
Sudha ma'am, just
Yes.
a very big
Dr.
thanks.
Shweta?
Yeah, just a very big thanks from my side to all the participants for their wonderful comments and feedback. And I'm sure that we'll all get through these times as well, and we'll come up with very different ways of looking at it. And thank you, Sudha ma'am, for giving me this opportunity, and to Maristella College. And it's always wonderful to be a part of something like this. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you.
Welcome, ma'am. And I think we should have more sessions with you to
That
know
would be a
how
pleasure,
we can go about with online classes and how to make it more interesting.
Sure, ma'am. That will be a
Thank
pleasure.
you, ma'am. It was a very, very relevant session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta ma'am.
And I thank all the participants once again. And I thank our IT team. I think hats off to the IT team who made it possible. You know, without any glitch, we could conduct the program. And I think it was a hat trick. So the 3 days went off very well. And I thank all the participants once again who were so active. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice day.
Thank you, ma'am.
I also thank the Department of English for their tremendous support in organizing this webinar.